listening to the Veterans Impact Show, continuing the mission of service and bringing together our civilian and military communities. Brought to you by Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Don't worry, retire happy and work with us. Great day to you. This is Jim Blythe, U.S. Navy veteran. Joining me today, a great American patriot. But also I want to say a thank you to Nathaniel for your engineering and all you do, and to my wife, Diane. And I'm sorry Chuck Wright couldn't be with us today. It's always a blessing when he's here and part of this show. I want to say thank you to our radio network in South Texas and our TV network out in California. And also say this is sponsored by Fairway Independent Mortgage. My NMLS number is 311548. And Fairway is 2189. We're an equal opportunity lender. Now, I got all the legal stuff out of the way. Let's talk about the mission continues. The whole point of why we do this program is to highlight and showcase great American heroes, veterans who do amazing things in the community. I've got a fantastic opportunity to introduce you to Allen B Clark, the Honorable Allen B Clark, author, leader, West Point graduate, amputee, an amazing man with an amazing story. Allen, welcome aboard.
Well, I'm delighted to be your guest today, I assure you.
Oh, man. Listen, I listened to your interview December 22nd, and I think that's on your website, and I tell everybody, go do that, because it's really done by a psychologist, and you're talking about your recovery from being an amputee. So let's go back, though. What was so amazing, you wanted to be a West Pointer when you were 8 years old.
Yeah, I didn't.
You talk about determination.
Well, I was, most Army brats, which I was, my dad was in the Army, collect Army patches. And I had what I considered a tremendous collection of Army patches. And I found one day. I didn't know what it was. So I showed my daddy. I said, "What is this, Dad?" He said, "Allen, that's the United States Military Academy at West Point." I said, "What does that mean, Dad?" He said, "Well, that means they train officers." And he pointed out some of the West Point graduates on the post we were at in Sendai, Japan, in northern Japan, during the Army of Occupation in 49 or so. And I said, wow. So I had my eyes set on West Point at age 8, and I never deviated. Tunnel vision. I was a good kid. I studied hard. I wanted to get into the academy.
Isn't that amazing? and a lot of people don't realize, I think a lot of that comes from genetics of being part of a military family, but in that environment, and you're talking about determination, you're talking about persistence, and you're talking about really developing leadership. That's amazing. Most kids that are 8 years old can barely quit sucking their thumbs. So I'm impressed. So you went on from West Point to serve in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group. You were a paratrooper, airborne qualified. That had to be something else, all of the training you went through there.
Well, a paratrooper means you have to have at least 6 parachute jumps. I'm only airborne qualified, and that means I went to 5 parachute jumps at Fort Benning School. I'd originally been commissioned Corps of Engineers, so my first assignment was 17th Engineer Battalion, Fort Hood, Texas, in '63. I got married the first time in '63, right after 6 months after graduation, and I volunteered for something known as Jungle Operations Training in Panama, which was a very interesting experience for about 11 days down there. And so I went through that. We did at Fort Hood, by that time, 63, 64, 65, counter-guerrilla, counterinsurgency training. So I'd had all of that. And my first wife wanted me to get out of the military. And I was just devastated. She was from Dallas, and she wanted to come back to Dallas, live the good life, whatever that means. I was just devastated. And I said, well, maybe if I transfer to military intelligence, I'd get in the Foreign Area Specialty Program, specialize Central America, South America, and utilize my Spanish. My mother is Hispanic. Her father was a an emigre from Asturias, Spain, in the early 1900s with his brother. So she spoke Spanish before she spoke English, always spoke English with an accent. So I had that tradition. I was #1 in my class in Spanish at West Point. So I thought about that, and she said, originally she said, well, let's do that. So I transferred to military intelligence, and the general officer from what I was an aide-de-camp, he was really upset. So why are you transferring out of combat arms? I said, it's because it's a marriage issue. So then she decided she didn't want that either. So my choice was to preserve my marriage or lose my marriage and continue my career. So obviously I chose my marriage. I had a chance to be a general's aide and go to Korea and miss Vietnam, miss the war. I could not do that. My duty on our country, motto of West Point, and my own personal integrity said, I must go to the war or I will never be able to face my classmates at reunions in the past, because by that time we'd already had my classmates killed in action. So I volunteered for Vietnam, did not tell her. Big mistake, big mistake. Took 25 years for her to forgive me, and that's another amazing story. But so I end up in Vietnam. I'm a POW interrogator. That's what I was trained to be. No POWs to interrogate. And I said, this is boring. I'm at the beach at Nha Trang every day at 3 o'clock, you know? And so I'm on a plane one day with a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, who was one of the commanding officers over there, Special Forces, and he'd been a tactical officer at West Point, sat next to him, made the mistake of telling him I was bored. He said, well, Alan, I tell you what, you transfer to Special Forces and you will not be bored. And I said, well, yeah, I guess I'm qualified. He said, I'll make you an S2, which is an intelligence officer for one of what's called a B team at a town called Bon Matut. So I transferred to Special Forces within about a week. The executive officer of my military intelligence unit in Nha Trang had been my professor of civil engineering at West Point. I mean, the Lord has placed people in my life constantly over and over and over again that had a part in my life. And here he is. He said, Alan, that's what you want to do. He wanted me to be a Corps of Engineers at the academy. And he said, if that's what you want to do, it's done. A week later, I'm at Special Forces. So I'm there for a week. And I said, okay, why am I not up country? He said, we've changed your orders. You've changed my orders. I said, why don't you tell me? He says, well, we can't. He said, it's classified. I said, I'm going to have an assignment, and you are not telling me what it is. He says, no, cannot tell you yet. So I found out that it was espionage against Cambodia, and I said, uh-oh. So that's kind of what got me into Vietnam and my assignment.
Man, I got to tell you, there was so much going on, and so few people know all of the backstories that were going on. I mean, I didn't know Navy SEALs and Marine Corps Force Recon were all over North Vietnam gathering intelligence. And it's amazing what we don't know that went on and what Americans did to basically save lives. Now, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about your books, but I want to get to an important thing without going real deep because it's painful. You got severely injured. You lost both of your legs from the knees down. Tell us just a little bit about that, please, sir.
Yeah. Well, I was in the 10 and a half months into my tour of the 12-month tour in Nam, and I'd been in an area near what's called the tri-border point, which is where Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam touch. So my mission there as an intelligence officer was to recruit Montagnards, who are the mountain people of that area, the natives, to go back into their village areas that we had moved them out of, to get them to what's called sanctuaries, hamlets, protected hamlets, where we had Vietnamese soldiers nearby or special forces, to go back to their old areas toward the border. I was very unsuccessful in that, and I discovered later that the area between my camp, Doc Do Special Forces Camp, and the border was the most heavily underground bunkered area in the entire country. Underground supply points, underground hospitals, you name it. They'd go down underground and stay down there, and you couldn't find them, obviously, and they'd come up and attack our forces. So an enemy battalion came from Cambodia, which at the time historically was a privileged sanctuary, which means Prince Sihanouk allowed them to use his country as a base of operations when they came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They'd be there, come across, attack American troops and South Vietnamese, go back across the border. They were protected. Well, in early June 1967, a regular Army North Vietnamese battalion, pith helmets, khaki uniforms, and AR, and their weapon, the AK-47, which was different than the typical Viet Cong that we had fought, came across the border, ambushed one of our patrols from my camp, killed 2 out of 3 Americans, and the one American survived, came back, and we sent what's called a Mike Force in to retrieve the bodies. And what the communists typically do to our bodies cannot be discussed. But they got the bodies, they brought them back, but apparently those 4 Americans on the patrol also got killed. So we had 6 out of 7 Americans killed within about 10 miles of the camp. So my commanding officer realized I was undercover. I was a United States Army captain, infantry brass instead of military intelligence brass, and false ID, et cetera, et cetera. So he realized that my mission was over because I could not send my agents into that heavily armed territory with the battalion. So he said, I'm picking you up at 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning, June 17, 1967. He said, you're out of there. I said, okay. I'm out of there. My war's basically over. I'm going to take an R&R, which I hadn't taken, train a replacement, and then come back to the United States at the end of 12 months. So in a Special Forces camp, every 2 hours, there is an American on shift between 10 and 6. I get the 4 to 6 shift. I'm going to be finished at 6, go have breakfast, pack my duffel bag. I'm on the airstrip. I'm out of there at 9:30. At 4:30, that battalion, which had ambushed our patrols, moved all the way through the jungle fast within about 48 hours and set up mortar and rockets across positions across this little river, which was on the south side of our camp. And they began a mortar attack. And I'm the officer, I'm the American Special Forces guy awake. So I start to grab guys to man our 3 mortar pits to get flares in the air in case there's a ground attack from any side, and to get counter battery fire, as it's called. Plus, people are running around, when an attack starts. So I'm literally grabbing a guy and say, you go to that pit and load. I go over to one pit. He says, I need a Special Forces man that's trained to help me with this mortar. So I'm grabbing that. And so I'm in the middle of all that, And I have the radio calling down to the downstairs command center. Everybody's underground except me, I guess. And all of a sudden, bam, I'm on my stomach. Really heavy, hit like a baseball bat. Hit me across the top of my back. And I'm on the ground, and I yell out, oh, God, I'm dead. And the medic about 15 feet away in an underground bunker hears me and starts up to help me. And he gets knocked down into the bunker with a piece of shrapnel in his left shoulder because a round hits about a 7-foot diameter round. It makes a hole about 10 feet away from the front, and he took some shrapnel. And then another medic comes in and starts to take care of me, and I have the details of that. It's gruesome. I found out years ago. So that was it.
So you lost both of your legs from the knees down?
No, well, one leg immediately traumatically, and the right leg was broken in 5 places. So I kept it for 10 days. Back in the States, they took it off also.
Okay, so then you came back to the States. Would you go to Brooke
Army, Brooke
in
Army.
San Antonio?
Yeah.
And you went through so much trauma. Now, we're going to take a break in just a second to hear from our sponsors, and we're going to come back and talk about all you went through, because I want to set the stage about how you became a man of faith and how you saved your own life and how you have gone forward to also be a very, very active veteran. You worked with the VA. You were a undersecretary, I believe. Assistant secretary. So this is an enormous story of overcoming tremendous hardship and overcoming being a amputee. So this is Jim Blythe with the Veterans Impact Show. We're glad to have you aboard. Share this fantastic information. Get us out there. Be part of our team. And let us know any way that we can help you. So this is the Veterans Impact Show. We'll be right back after these words. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. Well, today I've got a great American patriot, and we're telling his story about being severely injured in Vietnam. But where I really want this to go is for him to talk about his books and then talk about how his faith saved his life. So, Alan, would you please tell us a little bit about your books as a lead into how you became a man of faith, please?
Well, I started collecting stories, and of course my own story was there and it was lived through the years. And people urged me to tell my story. I'd come to Rotary clubs or different groups, and they urged me to do it. So I did a self-published book in the mid-'80s. And I did it because I was running for a public office at the time. But later, I decided to put it in real formalized form. It's called Wounded Soldier, Healing Warrior, and it was published by a company up in the Midwest. And it's my autobiography, and it's a story that I asked Ross Perot, who died a couple of years ago, to do my foreword, and he very graciously did it, because my first job after I got out of the graduate school after the Army and hospital and graduate school was for Ross Perot, so he did it. And so I put together my story of my desire to be an officer and what happened to me in Vietnam, and it went through into the 90s, I suppose. And the thing in the hospital was very traumatic, admittedly. I've gone on and recovered, and I can go into more detail on the recovery process. But the second book is called Valor in Vietnam. I get to know a lot of people between working at the National Veterans Affairs Department and liaison work as an assistant secretary, ran the National Cemetery System in the early 90s. I collected so many stories. They were just fascinating stories. And then I was originally going to do World War II. And then my friends started passing away and losing their memory, so I'd do Vietnam. So I did a second book called Valor in Vietnam, which is 19 stories, all the way from 1962 to 1977, all branches of the military, an Army nurse, and somebody that was involved in that North Vietnam incursions that you mentioned about force recon and the special operations into North Vietnam. I have a complete chapter on that because I found out about the man who was in charge of that in Saigon and everything about the Gulf of Tonkin and everything and what was happening back in the United States. A very historical book. And then as I continued to progress in civilian life, I really found out a lot about what was going on politically. And as my faith increased, then I came up with this third book. I mean, it takes a lot of time to write a book. I mean, my goodness gracious. And it took me 4 years to write this one, but it's about my faith, and it's about what I think has been happening in the world and how people, the elitists, have gotten us into wars in history and made money by people like me and others through the generations and the centuries have gone off to war to fight the wars, and they make money back in the United States. And I covered in that third book American Revolution, Civil War, Spanish-American War, and Banana Wars. And I talk about my personal faith. So that's my commercial on my books.
I can't wait, because Diane and I are going to buy these books and read them. Now, you can get them at Amazon.
Yes.
Okay, and here's your website for Facebook, and here are the books right here. And I think this is incredible. I think one of the most important things is Valor in Vietnam. People need to hear that, because there's been so much come out, like Stolen Valor, which is another book that I know the author and had him on. And there's a lot of bad stuff, but I want people to hear the good things. I want people to hear about the American heroes, like McCain, John McCain was one of my pilots in my squadron from VA 163. So it's important that we tell these stories. The other thing is, and we're in our next segment, we're going to be talking about your recovery, what you went through at the Brooke Army Medical Center, and how difficult that was. And I know it's a painful discussion, but the drugs and narcotics that you were having to take, the pain that you were in, these things are horrendous, and there are many civilians who've gone through accidents and things with similar problems. I want people to hear how your determination, how your faith brought you through, and you're a man of distinction today. You're a leader. You're involved in organizations. You worked for the VA. So when we come back, we're going to be talking about what does it do? How do you go about using your faith to change your life? Because this is the most important part of healing, I think, is your faith, whether you call it God, a higher power, Allah, whatever. Faith is what gives you the power and the strength. So this is Jim Blythe with the Veterans Impact Show. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these words. Welcome back. This is the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our great sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this conversation. Well, welcome back. You got Jim Blythe, U.S. Navy veteran, and Allen B Clark, Vietnam veteran, U.S. Army, West Point graduate, amazing man, the Honorable Allen Clark. Allen, let's complete the story to talk about, without getting into terrible detail, what you went through at Brooks so that people can relate who have been injured or have had major problems. Tell us a little bit about that, please, sir.
Yeah, well, the actual process of having your legs amputated and the skin being uncovered at the bottom underneath my kneecaps, they had to debride, number one. They had to go in and make sure they got all the shrapnel out of your leg and out of the bottom part of your knees and so forth. And so I had to go under surgery several times. So overall, while in the hospital, I had 12 surgeries, beginning with the original MASH hospital in Vietnam, and then 8 more surgeries since then. But it was very tough and hard because all the amputees were together. We had 4 double amputees. We were all next to each other with 3 enlisted men and myself. We're in 4 beds next to each other on the amputee ward. Eventually I moved to another ward. But very quickly I started developing issues with post-traumatic stress disorder. I know a lot about that. I've counseled probably hundreds of veterans through the decades relative to addressing post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we all have a little bit of post-traumatic stress. The disorder becomes, do we come back with anger management issues? Do we come back with issues that we cannot let go from the war? Emotional issues, issues of things we saw, things we did, things we didn't do, things other people did, whatever the case may be. And this relates to law enforcement. It relates to husbands and wives, and it relates to children can develop post-traumatic stress, no question about it. The issue is whether it goes to a dysfunctional situation and you have to heal from it. I started getting pills immediately. I started about 8 months, I was relatively okay, just mild prescription drugs for keeping me calm. And then I just lost touch. I started getting scared in the 8th month of my 15-month stay in the hospital. Got scared about what I was going to do with my life. How can I make a living? I'm going to be a guy that I'm almost 4'6", didn't have my artificial legs yet. And I said, what am I going to do? How am I going to make it in life? So I lost it. So for about 4 days, I went without sleep. I went without understanding what was going on, just lost it. And if you keep anybody awake for 4 days, they're going to go to a closed psychiatric ward. Went to a closed psychiatric ward for 14 weeks in the spring of 1968. Horrible time. Had to see a psychiatrist 3 times a week personally. Had to be in the group therapy, and it was just a fog. for 14 weeks. I had to get out of that, and about 5 more months, and I was able to be released from the hospital. Doctor says, you have to get a job after you go to grad school. Decide to go to an MBA at SMU. You have to get a very easy 9-to-5 job so you don't have any pressure on you. And I said, okay, I'll listen to that. And so I graduated from SMU. I found out about Ross Perot in town with his electronic data systems, EDS, hiring Vietnam vets. So I get an introduction to him, get hired as his personal financial assistant. There you go. I don't follow orders very well. I don't get what's called an easygoing job, very high-pressure job. And I had another break. Not as heavy as before, but I had a break again, post-traumatic stress after 6 weeks, and I had to quit working for Ross. He didn't put any pressure on me, put pressure on myself for excellence, and so had to start, didn't have a job, had to start all over, finding another job, age 28.
You, though, somewhere you developed a deep faith. You found your faith. And that's what pulled you out, isn't it?
Oh, by all means.
Tell me a little bit about that, because I think that's so important.
Yeah. I met a couple that you indicated you knew, Andy and Gail Seidel. He was going to the seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary, and they were going to a church called Fellowship Bible, which was the original founding church by Gene Getz from Dallas Seminary. And so Andy and Gail invite me to church. I'd always had an excuse about 71, 72. Why I couldn't go to church. Oh, it's just too far away. And he said, Alan, this is 6 blocks from your home. I said, oh my gosh, I'm stuck. So I have to go to church. I have to go to church. Okay. So I went to Fellowship Bible Church, and I got into a couples Bible study, the cell groups as they called it. And these people really had their faith act together, in my opinion. I said, I could never be like them. I mean, gosh, they know how to pray. We used to go to family events, and my daughters would, they'd ask me to pray, and my daughters, I said, I can't pray. Don't ask me to pray. Eventually asked me to pray, and years later, my daughters would stand next to me at family events, make sure they elbowed me so I wouldn't pray too long. So I had to learn how to pray and get my act together, and I had a Bible study that Andy led with 9 other Vietnam veterans. So we had a great time for a period of about a year or two at Andy's home. And then one day, Gene Getz said in the service, he says, there's a great eternal struggle of all time that is happening. It's good versus evil, God versus the devil. And that's the ultimate battle that we are all facing. That's the ultimate war that we're all in, the spiritual war. And, I looked up at the flag in our church meeting room, and I started cheering because I looked at that flag in the church, and I said, here I was almost giving my life, and others that I knew giving my life for freedom in a secular sense, in a earthly warfare battle and war. But I've never really gotten into the big picture of the real eternal struggle of all time, which is good versus evil, God versus the devil. That day was a turning point. That day was a turning point for me to realize that my own little world and my trauma from my war was nothing like the real war that I had to get into. So that's where I started progressing, studying the Bible, getting into it, and through the years I've added to my maturity relative to understanding spiritual warfare, getting active in a church, and being able to help other veterans heal. And for several years back, beginning about 15 years ago, for maybe almost 10 years, chaplains would invite me to military bases where I would give my testimony of faith, a very muted fashion, because they had all different kinds of faiths or no faith at all in the warrior transition battalions. But that's where my ministry and my own personal growth went faith-wise through the years.
I think that's an amazing thing, because when you combine faith with action, it gives you tremendous strength and ability to overcome. All of the doctors will tell you 87 to 90% of the medical conditions we have start in our thought process, start in our brain. And if we can change that, and then one of the things I have people say to me, because I went to seminary, I didn't get to complete it, because I started doing this radio show. And yes, Andy Seidel was one of my teachers at DTS. But I got to tell you, attitude equals altitude. And where do you get a great attitude? Well, you read the book of Proverbs. You read the book of Psalms. You read these ancient educational life texts, and you begin to go, wow, now I begin to understand. And as you go through, faith is so tremendously important. And whether or not you're Muslim and you study the Quran, if you're in Hindu, the Bhagavad Gita, if you're Confucius, whatever, having faith gives you tremendous emotional strength to overcome the tremendous hardships. And without a doubt, this world, we all go through hardship. If you were going to be a weightlifter, you can't lift weights if all you pick up is 10 pounds, right?
Right.
You have to strain, and that's part of what life is. We go through tests. You've been through one of the most ultimate tests in what you went through, and the way you came out of it was your faith. I think that's the story, because we want people to hear how important it is. Now, what you also did that is so amazing to me, you got appointed to VA. You became the Honorable Allen B Clark. Tell us about your government service.
I'd like to do that, but I'd like to go back to one other thing, if I may.
Please.
Because, you mentioned about whether you're of another faith or whatever, it's important. When I went to the military bases to speak to the Warrior Transition Battalions, the chaplains were very, very reticent about me talking about my faith. So the Lord told me one day, he says, Alan, this is what you say when you go into those. The Lord doesn't speak to me audibly. I mean, it's just you get a thought, but it's got to be from God. He said, you go into those Warrior Transition Battalions that have Jews, have Buddhists, have atheists, have Christians, have Muslims, whatever the case may be. You take this approach. You say, look, guys and gals out there, I don't care what your faith is. You follow your faith. I'll tell you what my faith is. It's Christianity. And my Christianity allowed me to heal from my post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you really want to work it out, you get with your faith and your faith leaders and you work that faith. I'm just telling you what worked for me. So I wanted to cover that.
Oh, I think that's so important. Well, now
I got distracted.
We do that. We have a lot of fun, and I hope you're enjoying yourself today.
I am, sure.
Alan, tell us about your government service, because I think that's remarkable.
Well, by not being able to be in the military anymore, which is my lifelong ambition, I still had this desire to serve and to do something for my fellow people in life. I got involved in politics in the 70s, and what that led to was a lot of visibility in the Dallas political community. And I have to tell you, I was a Republican, okay? And I got involved, was president of the 500-member Dallas County Republican Men's Club, got involved with that. And then eventually, when Governor Bill Clements was elected in 1978 as the first Republican governor in Texas history, politics, and during Reconstruction after the Civil War, I'd been involved in his campaign. I'd been chairman of his advisory committee or whatever. So he called me one day and he said, Alan, I want you to come down and I want you to be my administrative special assistant for administration at the Capitol building in Austin. I was working for a bank. And this is an amazing thing. I heard later that a senior officer of that bank, Republic National Bank, which is not in business anymore, back in 1971, when I needed another job that I spoke about before, Ross Perot went down and asked them to consider hiring me. There was a senior officer of that bank that did not want to hire me because I might lose time because I was a disabled veteran. Now, this is really sad because he had served in the military. In 1978, that same officer was called by Governor Clements to say, I want Alan Clark to come and be my special assistant in Austin. That officer, 7 years later, came to my desk in the bank to ask me, to tell me we're going to put you on a leave of absence to go work for the governor. So I got hired by the governor. So for 2.5 years, I was a special assistant administration. Had some wonderful liaison opportunities. The National Guard, handicapped community, you name it. Just some wonderful opportunities. Spoke on his behalf all over the state. So I got involved in politics. Knew people all over the state. 1982. We had an amazing thing happen. It had always been everybody statewide except for Clements had always been Democrats. And so he calls me up. I just had lunch with George W. Bush in Midland, who eventually, of course, became president. Had an hour-and-a-half luncheon. That afternoon, the governor of Texas calls me, and he said, Allen, I'm running for re-election. I'd like you to run for treasurer of Texas. Bingo. I mean, Allen Clark running for statewide office? Well, sure. I always answered the call when people thought I was, qualified for something. So I said, well, let me think about that. So I go back and talk to my oil company boss that had sent me out to Midland. And he said, Allen, you can't believe. Yes, I'm giving you permission. You work in my company Monday through Wednesday. You work in my company Midland 3 days. I'm giving you Thursday and Friday off, and the weekend, obviously, to go campaign around the state. Had a 4-month campaign, obviously lost, as did Clements. But that got me into that, and then by the late 80s, being involved in politics, the President George H.W. Bush administration recruited me to be an assistant secretary, go before the Senate Confirmation Committee. That's what made me the honorable until I have a felony conviction, I guess. And then after,
that'll never happen.
After 2.5 years, I run the National Cemetery System. So here in Dallas, our cemetery down southwest of downtown, I picked that site. I was there for the original groundbreaking. And so I have a real affinity for that site because I recommend it to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
I got to tell you, we go down there all the time. I remember taking Diane's dad and mom, and he was an Air Force, Army Air Corps B-24 pilot down there one year. That is one of the most beautiful in Dallas. I'll tell you what, when we come back, we're going to be wrapping up. But again, talking about service to the community, service to veterans, and leadership. I'm talking with Honorable Allen Clark, an Assistant Secretary in the VA under the George H.W. Bush administration. What a great man. I got to tell you, this is an important interview. Share it, enjoy it. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. I am having a great interview with a great American. Actually, I met this man in 2018 when I was on the Board of Governors for the Greater Dallas Military Foundation, and he was our honoree. I really didn't know it. And now I find out, well, we have all these mutual friends together. Gene Getz, Andy Seidel, Colonel Andy Seidel. And I'm like, wow, when you get a chance and you meet veterans, when you meet people and you get to know them, that's what it's all about. So I am always encouraging veterans to get tuned in, get plugged in, join your VFW, join the American Legion, join an organization, and do something for yourself and the community by being a part of that. Christian encouragement, I think, is also important. And being part of prayer groups, being part of Bible study groups that you talked about, Allen, I think is so important. And I went to fellowship. I know Gene Getz quite well. So these are important components to having a tremendously successful life. Instead of standing on a street corner with a sign saying, I'm a homeless veteran, you are a man who stood up even though you were severely injured, and you've accomplished a great deal. Now, I would like to wrap up, and one of the things that I always ask, and this is almost a ridiculous, redundant question, but what would you say to a young man or woman who's in high school, in college, and thinking about the military, when they hear all of these negative things, and especially from a man who was so severely injured in combat, what would you say to that young man and woman about starting a life in the military?
People have asked me, would you do it again? Well, I would go into the military again. I would go to the military academy at West Point, become an Army officer again. Would I ever want to go through what I've gone through? Well, of course not. Okay? But would I want to be a man in society as an American today who knows that I did my duty? And now that leads to something above and beyond just people going into the military. And choosing the military for a career, which I think is still very, very important. We have enemies around the world that are constantly probing us. They're constantly doing things to other countries that we need to be involved, and we need to always be concerned about our national security. And is it in America's national interest for us to do something in warfare? And my third book, Soldier's Blood and Bloodied Money, relates to that as far as an analysis of taking a look at the political aspects of getting involved in combat, because I'm a sincere believer that many of our wars, many of our incursions, where we have gone and suffered and died and bled and sacrificed through the centuries and through history, have been because other people had a certain reason. They either had territory they wanted to gain, they want to be more powerful, they want to make more money, whatever the case may be. So despite all of this, the fact is the world we live in is reflective of those things that the big people in the world through history have applied to. But through the years, dozens and dozens and dozens of veterans, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to talk to them personally, beginning at the VA when I was a high-level political appointee, but also spouses, women, parents, whatever the case may be. Veterans have contacted me, and those are some of the important things I'd like to relate and be able to mention about the approach that I take, some of the anecdotes that I've heard as far as how to get your act together.
To me, it's all about leadership and becoming a young man or a young woman of maturity. And the military gets you there faster than anything. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. My grandfather was career military. My father was Navy. I am third generation Navy. I bleed Navy blue. And we're involved with Sea Cadets now. We're continuing the mission as we're instructors with Sea Cadets, Diane and I. So I want to say thank you for being on board. I want to close with a prayer because I know this is important. So, dear God, we thank you for men like Alan Clark. We thank you for the veterans who serve this great nation as they continue the mission. We thank you, God, for putting your hedge of protection and being the rampart around our active duty military, our first responders. Guide and protect them, God. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for blessing our nation. Thank you for healing our nation, bringing us back together. The important thing is, together we are stronger. This I pray and thank you today, God, for all you do for us. Amen. Alan, it is such an honor to have you on board today. I'm just so thrilled. I got to tell you, I want to be telling people about your books. Go to Facebook and share this. Go to YouTube and share this. Get this out because people need to hear. People who have been hurt, people who have been wounded need to hear. There is a way up and out, and attitude equals gratitude equals altitude. So this is Jim Blythe, the Veterans Impact Show. Thank you for being on board.